Arla Cravingdale is milk that stays fresher for longer. Staying fresh for 7 days opened or up to 21 days unopened. Arla Cravingdale tastes like heaven on day 7. Available in skimmed, semi-skimmed and whole milk. Pick up Arla Cravingdale in store for a taste of heaven.
Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process and for authors to learn valuable tips on producing and marketing your audiobooks. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Hello, and thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to dive into the question of finding the voice or voices for your audiobook, casting your audiobook. And so there are 4 main ways in which I see the casting realm as in terms of who will narrate and how we approach that question of casting. Those are author narrated, a single professional narrator, multiple narrators reading from a point of view perspective, and finally, a full cast approach. If you are an author and you are at that point in your process where you're thinking about your audiobook or you're planning for it, but you haven't cast it yet, this episode hopefully will be really helpful to you in the ways that you can think about how to approach this casting question. I would also encourage you to be working with an audiobook producer, such as Pro Audio Voices, where we can help you with that process and have a professional casting director as well. But let's jump into it. So let's start with the first category, and that is the author-narrated option. Many authors come to us and they are thinking that either because their book is written in the first person, or maybe it's a memoir, or it might be a nonfiction book where they're talking about their expertise for a variety of reasons, or maybe just because some friends of theirs have said, "Oh, you have such a great voice, you should narrate your own book." That last is probably the worst reason, I would say, as to why somebody should make that decision. So let's get into looking at that decision and ways to think about it so that you can approach that with a more full understanding about what your decision will entail and include, and reasons why you might want to or might want not to narrate your own audiobook. I also want to say that I have several other episodes that dive into this more completely, so I'm not going to go deep dive into the author-narrated experience and decision-making, but I am going to focus more on that decision-making aspect of it. Some reasons why it might make sense for you as an author to narrate your own include the importance of it being your voice, not from your own perspective so much as from the perspective of your listener. Now, there are some authors who are famous. They have famous voices. First that immediately comes to mind is Barack Obama. It would seem odd for somebody whose voice is so well known publicly to not narrate his own story, written in the first person, talking about his experience in the White House and leading up to that. So in a situation like that, it makes absolute sense for it to be the author's voice narrating. Most authors, of course, are not that famous in terms of their own voice being publicly known. Now, that being said, there are several authors who have already developed a following, and they may be either a public speaker, They may be a coach of some kind where their voice has become very well known to their followers. That can be another good reason why an author might want to record their own audiobook. Another related reason could be that if you have the intention to become that well-known speaker or coach where your voice will become well-known to your followers, and maybe you're just getting started on that process, that can be a reason as well. All that said, though, for most of those scenarios, and I would maybe use the one exception of the Barack Obama, that famous, like world famous voice, pretty much anyone else can have their audiobook narrated by a professional narrator without any downside to the listener or any downside for the author. And many times, authors who have developed quite significant business around themselves are so busy running that business, traveling, whatever it is that they're doing, that they may not want to take the considerable time and effort to devote it to the narration of their own audiobook. And that is really who you've written your book for, right? From the listener's point of view, a very common experience is that we recognize that a particular book is written by a particular person and may be narrated by a different person. So we recognize that right up front, and we go with it. We accept that the narrator, who is literally as the actor stepping into the shoes and becoming the voice of the author, we accept that that is the voice of the author, and we go with it. Many authors will also take advantage of is that, let's say there is a note from the author or a preface or acknowledgments or something along those lines. It could be multiple pieces of front matter and back matter that an author will choose to narrate in their own voice and then essentially turn it over to the professional to handle all the rest. So that's a way that the author can have their voice in there, but then not have to do the bulk of that narration work. Many, many times I have talked with authors who were concerned largely because it was typically a memoir, where someone feels like it's such a personal experience that I wrote my book about. And they think that they need to be the one, because who else can really embody the energy of that story, really understand it, really speak as the author. And the thing is, though, that this is the gift of a great narrator. This is what we do, is we, as actors, step into and embody the author and the author's voice. And because we are also trained in the art of narration and the craft of narration, we typically can do that work even more effectively than the author themselves, even though it's their story. Because the craft and the art of that work is a set of skills that are developed over many years, typically. You can hopefully realize that when I've worked with author narrators who have insisted that, yes, they feel they need to be the voice, that's okay. We'll work with them on that. But because they haven't developed those skills, many times they're just not able to really bring the story to life in the way that they intend to. Now, it may be coming alive very much in their own minds, but I'm always approaching things from, let's pay attention to what the listener experience is, because when you create a great experience for the listener, they're going to tell their friends. They're going to recommend your audiobook to others. And your story is going to be better received, more effectively told, and all of that should matter to you. There is also just one other category I'll mention, and that is if, in fact, you want your audiobook recorded simply for your family. This is maybe just a legacy, personal project. That's a different thing. If you're not recording it for a general audience, you just want your family to be able to hear your voice specifically, that is different. That's not typically who we at Pro Audio Voices are working with. Most of our authors have recognized their own memoirs or their own, whatever their books are, that they are written for a broader audience. Or at the very least, even if their project as a memoir, let's say, was originally written for their family, they realize that through the writing process often, that there is a larger story to be told and shared with a wider audience. So what I would like to encourage you to consider is to free your imagination and allow your story, your content, your material to come alive as best that it can in audio. Create the best experience for your listener. And I know that can be challenging for some who may not feel like they can trust their baby, their book, with a professional narrator. But I want to encourage you here to keep your mind open, allow your imagination to let go, allow your control, the desire to hang on to it so tightly, allow that grasp to ease and explore the possibilities with the idea of creating the very best listening experience that you can for your audiobook. Okay, so now let's move on from the author narrated to a single professional narrator for your audiobook. With this, as we're thinking about, who's going to be that voice for your audiobook, there are some main things that I think are best to focus on. And the main one is about the energy of it. The energy, the tone of your book. You want a voice, an actor who's going to be able to embody that. Because when you have that, the story is going to come to life. And another thing that you'll want to pay attention to is, especially if you have a lot of dialogue, you will want to listen to how the actor handles that dialogue. And I do recommend that you make sure you can hear how they handle female voices and male voices, assuming you have both in your dialogue, so that you can make sure that the narrator can handle well that kind of work, that dialogue work. Some narrators are really great at nonfiction and not as great at fiction. They're maybe not as great at the dialogue voices, and that's fine. You're just trying to find the best match for your content. Another component that you may want to pay attention to is about pronunciations. And I mean this specifically if you have, let's say, some accents that are really important, or foreign languages within your book that are really important to be able to pronounce properly and to sound fluent with. Another might be if you have a lot of technical terminology, like medical terms. It can be really helpful to have somebody narrating who's more familiar with the realm that you're dealing with, that your content addresses. When it comes to how deep the voice is, or is it more of a tenor voice, or is it more of a nasal voice, or more of a breathy voice? These are just going to be questions that are going to come back to your personal preferences. Typically, they are less about the material itself, as long as whatever that voice is going to be able to convey the energy and the tone. Now, let's say, for example, you've got a woman who has a really breathy voice, and, maybe there's just a lot of air in that voice. And you have, let's say, a hardcore, violent, psychological thriller. Well, that might not be the best choice for it. Then again, depending on your particular writing, it might be. So you're just, again, trying to find a really good match. Let's take a short pause, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about multiple voices, both from a point of view approach and then also full cast approach.
Do you have a book that you imagine with multiple voices, or a screenplay or stage play? At Pro Audio Voices, we love working on these more complex productions with music and sound effects and a full cast of voices. Bringing together decades of experience in both theatre and audio production, our team brings your project to life. From manuscript preparation to casting to directing the actors and a post-production team to bring it all together, Pro Audio Voices brings your project to life. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com/full-cast.
And we're back. So the next one we're going to talk about is using multiple voices. And this is typically because your book is written in or from multiple points of view. Personally, I love these kinds of stories. I think that they're really fun, narrated with different voices for the different character points of view. And we've been doing a lot of these projects at Pro Audio Voices. And so the way this typically works is that for each of the characters, that chapters are written from their point of view. So let's say you have 3 main characters, and the chapters each will be written from one of those main 3 characters from their point of view. And so the casting then would be to find the 3 voices that are going to represent or enact those main characters. Now, within that, you can also incorporate a sort of a full cast approach in that you can have the dialogue within that chapter enacted with the different voices who are doing those other characters or not. And one of the things that we like to do is when we're just doing it as one character narrating the entire chapter, including all of the dialogue, including the dialogue that is said by other actors in their own point of view chapters, is we like to provide for each of those actors the sound of those other actor voices so that when they, just as an example, let's say we've got one actor who has maybe a higher pitched voice. Well, if a different actor then portrays them in their dialogue within their chapter at maybe a low gravelly voice, well, that won't be as good a fit, right? So we want to make sure that they and are able to hear what the other actors sound like so that they can bring as full and consistent a sound across the entire audiobook to their work. So coming back to the casting question, again, we're thinking about that energy, the conveying the tone, but now we're doing it in terms of we're casting a character. So it's not just about a storyteller telling the story. It is really about the character that you're casting. And do they have the energy, the voice, the tone that fits the character? And then because it's going to be fit in with other voices from the other points of view, how do those fit together from that adjacent perspective, right? So you're thinking about the casting of the characters when you're casting those voices, and then you may be addressing things like accents as well, making sure that your actors can do the accents that are required, if there are any, and then how they fit together when they're juxtaposed. And then moving on to the 4th category, the last one, the full cast. This, again, is one of my very favorite ways to do an audiobook. I love full cast audiobooks. I think they really bring stories to life in such a vibrant way. It is important to do a full cast audiobook. I think it really demands a manuscript to start with that does have a pretty dialogue heavy approach. In other words, there is a lot of dialogue within the overall text. I think that just works better. So when we're casting in the full cast, similar to the multiple voices for the different points of view, we are casting characters. And in this case, most often there are many characters to cast. So we're looking at, well, who are the main characters that have most of the dialogue? And whenever possible, or using an actor to do only those primary character voices, and then allowing the secondary, possibly, or tertiary, or just, the bit parts to be doubled up and, tripled up by other people who are really good at giving us different kinds of voices, different sounds, right? So there's a couple reasons why I think that having a pretty good diversity in the cast of a full cast project. And here, when I'm talking about diversity, I'm really meaning that the voices sound different from each other. And the big reason is because ideally in a full cast project, it is as close as we can get from audio-only perspective, as close as we can get to like a film or an audio drama, right? We're trying to do as much as possible, remove the attributions, the he saids, she saids, and whenever it can be clear who's talking, then we're more easily able to pull out those little extras that may not be needed. They're helpful in the print text because we don't have any vocal clues. We can tell sometimes by paragraphs if there's maybe two people in a scene, then it's pretty easy. Well, similarly, in an audiobook, we can tell if it's, a man and a woman, let's say, in a scene. We don't need he said, she said, right? It's going to be really obvious because we can just tell from the sound. When there are scenes with many characters in it, and we're just wrapping up production for Postcards to Hitler, a German Jew's defiance in a time of terror. That, as a full cast audiobook, there are scenes where there are many people in the scene having dialogue. There are many people talking, conversation. And it makes it all the more important that we, as much as possible, can have these distinct voices. In the case where you have many voices, many characters in a scene, it's a little harder even as a reader, whether you're, not in an audiobook, but in a textbook. It's a little harder to track always who each of these people are unless you've set them up extremely well. So in those cases, we may need some more of those attributions as to who's talking, even with the distinct voices. But what I wanted to point out here is that in the casting process, what we're trying to achieve is to, as much as possible, have each voice sound distinctly different from each other character voice in a scene, right? So it doesn't sound like the same actor reading two different characters in a scene where there are many different voices. And these are some of the challenges that we face in the full cast project, managing to both, keep the budget from going way off the charts and also providing this really optimal listening experience. So again, with full cast, we're looking for many voices typically, and a diversity of sound with those voices, knowing that the smaller roles are going to double up or triple up to make the overall project stay manageable, and that works really well. So there's not, there are many reasons for having actors who are doing multiple really small parts. For example, if you hire somebody who's just going to do like a 10 words in your audiobook because it's the taxi driver, I just want them to do these 10 words. Well, the time commitment from the actor is more than you're probably going to want to fairly compensate for if you've got a whole bunch of those. And hopefully I'm making the point clearly, but basically it doesn't really make sense for anyone in the equation, to have one person reading just a tiny, tiny little role in an audiobook. It makes much more sense to find the ways in which in each scene that ideally actors are not going to be reading against themselves. In other words, reading more than one character within a given scene, and still provide the overall distinct voices that the different characters that we're creating throughout the audiobook, whether they're bit parts or whether they're, full, primary characters, and also managing the budget for the project and keeping that under control. So I hope that this has been helpful. Again, to sum up, the different ways that you might cast your audiobook could be author narrated, a single professional narrator, multiple voices, often that is related to having multiple points of view, but there are many other ways, many other reasons why you might have multiple voices doing a particular audiobook project. And I have other podcast episodes about that. And then full cast. So, if you have questions, please reach out to us at proaudiovoices.com. We love meeting with authors and hearing about your projects and helping you figure out the best way to not only cast your audiobook, but to take it from finished manuscript all the way out there to launched audiobook and beyond. Thanks again for joining me today. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.